The strange thing about my husband's funeral wasn't the silence. It was how carefully my grandson slipped the folded note into my hand, like he was afraid someone might see. He didn't look at me. He just whispered, "Grandpa told me, only if something happened." My stomach tightened instantly. Thomas had fainted twice the week before, and he'd been acting restless, but I never imagined this. My fingers shook as I opened the note, and the first line made my chest go cold. "Evelyn, don't trust Ryan." My own son. My heart began pounding as I looked up and saw Ryan already watching me from across the chapel, too focused, too alert. Then I read the second line. "If they ask you to sign anything tonight, say no." My breath caught because just minutes earlier, Ryan had already told me we needed to handle some paperwork after the burial. And suddenly, my husband's death didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like the beginning of something he had tried to warn me about, and something I might already be too late to stop. The funeral home smelled like lilies and polished wood, that artificial calm people try to create when grief is too heavy to manage on its own. And I stood beside Thomas's casket, trying to understand how a man I'd shared 38 years with could suddenly be reduced to silence, while my grandson Noah stood beside me, unusually still for an 11-year-old, his hands fidgeting with the sleeve of his jacket, until he finally slipped the folded note into my palm, his fingers trembling as he whispered that Grandpa told him to give it to me only if something happened. And that phrasing alone made my chest tighten, because Thomas hadn't been himself lately, not since the 2 fainting episodes the week before, not since he started locking his office drawer at night, something he'd never done in 38 years. And I tucked the paper quietly into my purse before anyone noticed, but when I looked up, Ryan was already watching me from across the room, his expression calm but focused in a way that didn't feel like grief so much as attention, like he was tracking something. And Ryan had always been composed, even as a child, the kind of boy who rarely showed emotion. But today his calm felt practiced, almost rehearsed, and he walked over slowly, placing his hand on my shoulder and telling me I should sit down because I'd been standing too long. And I nodded, letting him guide me to the front pew, while my thoughts kept circling the folded note burning inside my purse, and Thomas's last week replayed in my mind, the late-night phone calls he took outside, the way he'd asked me casually where I kept the spare house keys, the way he'd insisted Noah spend more time with him, teaching him how to organize old paperwork, something that didn't seem important at the time but now felt deliberate. And my daughter Melissa leaned beside me, asking quietly if I still had Dad's house keys. And the question felt oddly timed because Thomas had only been gone for less than an hour, and she glanced briefly toward Ryan before straightening again. And that glance didn't feel like shared grief. It felt like coordination. And the minister began speaking about Thomas's construction company, how he built it from a small contracting business into something stable, how he coached Ryan's little league team after 14-hour workdays. But instead of listening, I noticed Ryan checking his watch, Melissa whispering something to her husband Greg, Claire sitting behind them, watching everyone carefully. And every time my hand brushed my purse, Ryan's eyes flicked toward me like he was waiting for something. And when the service ended, we approached the casket and I touched Thomas's hand one last time, remembering the way he'd squeezed mine 3 nights earlier, telling me quietly that if anything happened, I should call Michael Bennett, his attorney. Something I'd brushed off at the time because Thomas had always been cautious about business matters, but now it echoed louder, and Ryan tightened his grip on my shoulder, telling me gently that I should stay at their house tonight because I shouldn't be alone. And Melissa immediately agreed, saying they'd already prepared the guest room. And that word already made my stomach tighten because no one had asked me about my plans. and Greg nodded, saying they take care of everything, and I felt the folded paper in my purse again, and Thomas's words flashed in my mind. Don't trust Ryan. Don't sign anything tonight. Call Michael Bennett. And I forced a tired smile, telling them I thought I'd rather sleep in my own bed. And Ryan frowned just for a second before smoothing his expression and telling me it wasn't safe for me to be alone. And something about that phrase made a chill move slowly down my spine, because Ryan had never worried about my safety before. And for the first time in my life, I looked at my son not as the boy I raised, but as a man I suddenly wasn't sure I understood. And as we walked toward the exit, I realized something that made my hands feel cold. Thomas hadn't just left me a warning, he'd left me instructions, and whatever he feared wasn't grief or confusion, it was something he believed would happen tonight, and I was already standing in the middle of it. If someone you trusted left you a warning at their funeral, would you follow it immediately or assume grief was making you paranoid? The wind at the cemetery cut through my coat as the final prayer ended, and the gray Chicago sky hung low above the headstones, while I dropped a white rose onto Thomas's casket, watching it disappear slowly as 38 years of shared mornings, arguments, quiet dinners, and ordinary routines were lowered into the ground in less than 5 minutes. And Ryan's arm wrapped around my shoulders, steady and supportive to anyone watching. But the words from the note kept echoing in my head, "Don't trust Ryan." And the contradiction made my chest tighten, because this was my son, the boy I had stayed up with during fevers, the teenager Thomas taught to drive, the man now holding me gently, as if nothing had changed, yet everything suddenly felt different. And as people began drifting toward their cars, Ryan stayed close beside me, too close, his voice soft as he suggested I ride with him because I shouldn't drive today. And I nodded faintly, telling him I needed to say goodbye to Mrs. Collins first. And he hesitated before agreeing, telling me not to wander off. And the moment he turned away, I walked in the opposite direction, my pulse quickening, because Thomas's note felt heavier now, like it was pushing me forward. And Mrs. Collins stood near the gate, hugging me softly. And when I asked to borrow her phone, telling her mine had died, she handed it over without hesitation. And my fingers trembled as I dialed the number I hadn't used in years. Michael Bennett, Thomas's attorney. And the phone rang twice before a calm voice answered. And for a moment, I couldn't speak because everything felt unreal. But I finally whispered my name, and Michael's tone changed immediately, offering condolences before I told him Thomas had left me a note. And silence filled the line before he exhaled slowly and said Thomas had come to see him 3 days earlier, worried about pressure to sign documents that would shift control of the company. And my stomach tightened as I told him Ryan had already mentioned paperwork. And Michael's voice lowered, telling me not to sign anything, no matter what. And that Thomas had felt timing mattered, that if I was calling, it meant something had already started. And I glanced toward the parking area, where Ryan and Melissa were scanning the cemetery, clearly looking for me. And I told Michael quietly they were already searching, and he told me to act normal, attend the reception, and meet him later. And when I asked where, he said he would text me, and then added softly not to go home with Ryan. And my breath caught, because that matched Thomas's note exactly. And I handed the phone back, thanking Mrs. Collins before walking back toward the group, forcing my expression into quiet exhaustion. And Ryan spotted me immediately, asking where I had gone, and I told him I'd been saying goodbye. And he studied my face like he was searching for something beneath my grief. And Melissa joined us, suggesting we head to the reception. And as we walked toward the cars, my phone buzzed inside my purse, and I waited until no one was looking before checking it. A message from an unknown number, Marlowe's Diner, 9:30 p.m. And suddenly I realized I wasn't just attending a funeral anymore. I was stepping into something Thomas had anticipated, something he tried to prepare me for. And as Ryan opened the car door for me and asked again if I was sure I didn't want to come home with them, I smiled faintly, telling him I'd decide later. And he nodded, though something in his expression tightened slightly. And for the rest of the drive, I watched him carefully, noticing how he checked his phone twice, how Melissa whispered to Greg, how Claire remained quiet in the back seat. And for the first time in my life, sitting beside my own family felt less like comfort and more like being surrounded by people I suddenly wasn't sure I could trust. And as we pulled into the reception parking lot, I realized something that made my chest feel heavy. Thomas hadn't just warned me about Ryan, he'd warned me about tonight. And whatever they were planning hadn't ended at the cemetery. It was just beginning. If your own child started pushing paperwork the same day you buried your spouse, would you see it as concern or something far more calculated? By the time the reception ended, the sky outside had turned dark and quiet, and people hugged me one last time, their voices soft and sympathetic. But I barely heard them because my mind was fixed on the message in my phone. And when Ryan walked me toward the entrance, he asked again if I was coming home with them tonight, and I shook my head gently, telling him I needed time in the house. And he hesitated, studying my face longer than necessary, before nodding, while Melissa hugged me quickly. Greg gave a short, polite nod, and Claire watched silently, her expression unreadable. And when their SUV finally disappeared into the street, I stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of everything settle deeper into my chest, before walking toward my car and driving slowly through the quiet Chicago streets until Marlowe's Diner appeared like a small island of yellow light in the darkness, and Michael was already inside, seated in a booth near the back. And when I slid across from him, he studied my face carefully before pulling a thick envelope from his briefcase and asking quietly whether Ryan had asked me to sign anything. And when I told him yes, his jaw tightened slightly, and he opened the envelope, spreading documents across the table. And the first page read Temporary Emergency Authority Transfer, and I leaned closer, reading the details, realizing it would transfer operational control of Thomas's company to Ryan during a period of instability. And Michael told me to read paragraph 4, and my chest tightened as I saw the clause stating the acting director would determine when authority ended, meaning Ryan could decide when to give it back, which meant it wasn't temporary at all. And I felt a slow, cold realization settle into my stomach because this looked less like protection and more like control. And Michael then pulled out another document showing Thomas had quietly restructured ownership 4 years earlier, placing majority control under my name. And my head lifted in shock because Thomas had never told me. And Michael explained Thomas feared tension within the family and wanted a safeguard without creating conflict. And my throat tightened because suddenly Thomas's recent behavior made more sense. And then Michael reached into his briefcase again and placed a small flash drive on the table, explaining Thomas had installed security cameras in his office after a minor company theft the previous year and had begun saving recordings when he noticed unusual behavior. And when he plugged the drive into his laptop, a video appeared, showing Thomas's office 3 weeks earlier and Ryan entering quietly, looking through desk drawers before leaving, and another clip showed Melissa entering days later, scanning documents quickly before closing the drawer. And then an audio file played, Thomas's voice, calm but firm, saying he wasn't signing anything, followed by Ryan's frustrated voice saying they needed to move faster. And the recording ended, leaving silence between us. And then Michael opened another file showing financial activity, not illegal but unusual, transfers being prepared, draft wire instructions connected to a new holding company Greg had recently helped establish. And Michael explained these weren't completed transfers, just preparations, but the timing was concerning. And my hands began to tremble slightly because it suggested planning, not necessarily wrongdoing, but something deliberate. And Michael then showed me a pharmacy pickup record. Greg had collected Thomas's medication refill 2 days before Thomas collapsed, and Michael clarified nothing suggested tampering, but Thomas had written a note questioning why Greg collected medication when I normally handled prescriptions. And that small inconsistency felt enough to make my stomach tighten, because Thomas had clearly started noticing patterns. And I sat back slowly, absorbing everything, realizing Thomas hadn't believed his family would harm him, but he had feared pressure, manipulation, and control. And when Michael closed the laptop, he told me quietly Thomas wanted me to avoid confrontation and gather more clarity first. And I nodded slowly because I understood now this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about understanding what Thomas feared and protecting myself until I knew more. And when I left the diner, the night felt heavier than before, and the drive home was quiet, my thoughts replaying every moment of the day, until I stepped onto my porch and noticed the porch light already on, though I didn't remember turning it on earlier. And when I entered the house, the silence felt different, like something had shifted, and I walked toward Thomas's office, noticing the drawer slightly open, and my phone buzzed, Ryan asking if I had thought more about paperwork, and I told him I would tomorrow. And when the call ended, I heard a faint sound outside and opened the door to find a small, sealed envelope addressed in Thomas's handwriting, and my hands trembled as I opened it, finding printed financial summaries and a short note saying, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get a chance to explain everything." And as I scanned the documents, I saw draft agreements and preliminary transfers, still incomplete, but clearly being prepared, and my chest tightened, because Thomas hadn't left me proof of betrayal. He had left me something more unsettling. He had left me evidence of planning and suspicion. And as I sat quietly in the house we built together, I realized something chilling. I wasn't just grieving my husband anymore. I was quietly stepping into the situation he had prepared me for. And tomorrow, when Ryan asked me again to sign those papers, I would smile and act uncertain, because Thomas hadn't prepared me to fight immediately. He had prepared me to understand first. And for the first time since his death, I realized the most dangerous part of tonight wasn't what I knew yet. It was what I still didn't know. If you discovered quiet signs your own family might be planning something behind your back, would you confront them or quietly let them believe you knew nothing? The next morning, the house felt colder than usual, and I barely slept as sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, and I poured coffee into Thomas's mug out of habit before realizing he wasn't there anymore. And my phone buzzed exactly at 9:12 a.m. Ryan's name appeared on the screen, and I answered softly, while forcing my voice to sound tired and uncertain. And he asked gently if I'd had time to think about the paperwork, and I paused just long enough to make my hesitation believable before telling him I didn't fully understand everything, and maybe he could come by and explain it. And the silence on the other end lasted a second too long before Ryan said he'd be there in 30 minutes. And when the call ended, I sat quietly staring at the documents Michael had given me and Thomas's note resting beside them. And something inside me shifted. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet clarity. Because Thomas hadn't prepared me to argue, he'd prepared me to watch. And when Ryan arrived, he looked composed, carrying a folder and offering a sympathetic smile that might have fooled me yesterday. But today, I noticed how his eyes moved quickly across the room, like he was checking whether anything had changed. And he sat across from me, spreading the documents carefully, explaining that this was only temporary to help stabilize the company while I adjusted. And I nodded slowly, asking simple questions, letting him explain everything while pretending confusion. And I watched him relax slightly as he believed his plan was still working. And then he slid the pen toward me, and my fingers hovered over the paper, and I looked at him quietly, asking one question that made his expression flicker just slightly. What happens if I don't sign? and he smiled calmly, telling me nothing would change, but the company might struggle without quick decisions. And I nodded again, slowly, placing the pen down instead of signing and telling him I needed a little more time. And the calm in his face tightened for just a second before he recovered and told me, "Of course, take all the time you need." And as he left, I watched him walk down the driveway, and for the first time since Thomas died, I realized something heavier than grief had settled inside me. Thomas hadn't just warned me about one conversation. He'd warned me about a long, quiet game. And as Ryan's car disappeared, I picked up my phone and called Michael, telling him quietly that Ryan believed everything was still normal. And Michael answered calmly, saying that was exactly what Thomas wanted. And I sat alone in the quiet house, realizing I wasn't just grieving my husband anymore. I was stepping into the role he had prepared me for. And somewhere in the back of my mind, one thought settled slowly and quietly. The most dangerous thing Ryan didn't realize yet wasn't that I suspected something. It was that I was no longer the woman he thought he could pressure. And for the first time since the funeral, I understood something chilling. Thomas's final act hadn't just been a warning, it had been the beginning of a plan. And now I was the one carrying it forward.